Welcome to Vibrational Revelations. Today we have a special guest and a very special episode. And today's episode is about ancient civilizations. We'll be revealing 10 ancient civilizations to all of you. So let me just go through the list of what they are, and then I'll introduce our amazing guest to all of you today. So the list is the Chinese civilization, the Roman, the Indus, the Aztec, the Incan, the Mesopotamian, the Persian, the ancient Greek, the Maya civilization, and the ancient Egyptian. This was a lot of fun, actually, to read and see where do we as a collective stand. And of course, you guys remember when we revealed the human collective at the moment, and we'll be going through all of the numbers for the civilizations of that particular time at the peak, right, of when it was happening. Before we begin, I wanted to also introduce our amazing co-host and guest, and let me read to you his long bio and introduction into him. So today's guest is Jousch Andris, and he's a Swiss citizen of the French-speaking minority coming from the family of Romansh origin. The fourth national language in the country is Latin, as it is spoken today in remote valleys of the eastern Switzerland that were leading to alpine passes, allowing for commercial, political, and religious influences to move from northern to southern Europe, or vice versa in terms of geography, linking the Po Valley in northern Italy to the Rhine Basin, or the Danube Basin leading to the north towards Rotterdam, or the east, Constanta in Romania and the Black Sea. All this to say that I always felt a European deeply aware of the common history with important cultural differences. After studies in English and history at the University of Lausanne, I did a PhD studies in international relations in Geneva that led me to work for the World Council of Churches before joining the European Cultural Center, also in Geneva. This led me to join the European Conference of University Rectors, Presidents, and Vice Chancellors in 1976, an NGO working on European cultural cooperation from the Canary Islands to Vladivostok, the Greater Europe. I was the Secretary General of the association until 2002, when I took over the smaller institution, the Observatory of Academic Freedom and Fundamental University Values based in Bologna, a job I kept until retirement in 2007. The observatory was focusing on academic malpractice and corruption in research as a kind of ombudsman between universities and their stakeholders. As I retired, I started all kinds of training in the world of invisible, beyond the rationality of my earlier professional life. And I know, Jousch, thank you so much. It's really an honor for us. I'm so grateful that you are here with your wealth of knowledge, history, and I know that you are an avid student of life, which I appreciate so much because I'm as well. I love learning. And recently you just told me that you were studying a Lemurian program as well, which I'm sure people will have questions for you at the end. But let's begin. Let's begin with the Chinese civilization, and the peak that we measured was between 1600 BC and 1046 BC. So I'm going to mute myself.
So may I say a few words to begin with? When you speak of civilization, civilization is something very big, very long, etc. So I was wondering how you could define it so that we could focus in such a way that when you give numbers, it corresponds to the great moment of that civilization, not to the decline or to the early moments of it, because this is secondary as we are speaking very widely for the moment. So, you know, a civilization for me is a group of people who organize around common beliefs, common behavior that leads to common law. And a civilization is, or a group in a making a civilization is like a shoal of fish. You know, there are millions of individual fish, but they all move along the same pattern. And when the fish turns left, the shoal turns left, everybody turns left, or vice versa. So that's the idea of a civilization. And so the format of the group is very important. And the format of the group is expressed in culture. Civilization is not the same thing as culture. And the word culture comes from the Latin colere, which means draw a furrow in a field. Colere is, that gives the idea of culture, agriculture, as the same as culture, official great culture. So this is the way, you know, the furrow can be physical, psychological, artistic, and everything is part of this. So the great moments of a civilization is when the culture is structured, full, and gives the impression that the whole universe around this civilization or this group of people makes sense. Of course, it can make sense differently if you are in Olmec country in Mesoamerica, or if you are in Uluru in Australia, but still it's the same model. So that's the basis of what I've been doing. When you were speaking of Chinese culture, it's 7,000 years. It depends how you calculate. So, you know, you have to decide where you stop. So do you want me to, from that introduction, to move to what I have to say about China? Because that's what we are going to do now. It's not my, okay. My paper. So China is a fascinating area because it's the longest tradition, which is not cut. You know, you go back to 6,000 years ago, and you had already Chinese groups which are very much similar to the Chinese cultural groups of today. So the first groups were, well, it always starts like that. It's usually farmers in a certain area and who grow and develop a surplus in the food and start trading with other people, and it develops like that. So in China, the first tribes or groups were around the Yellow River. And you can consider the Yellow River Basin as the heart of the Chinese identity. Of course, afterwards it moves to the Yangtze, to other part of the area, and then up to Tibet. This is what in the 10th, 11th century, etc. So, getting to the size of what we know on our maps as China. So you had first the Xia, then the Shang, then the Zhao, and this is from 6,000 to 2,000 roughly, and the Zhao is from 1046 to 256, and it's when you go in a museum, it's then that you are going to see very beautiful bronze utensils, etc., which are from this period. Then China is, like many of the other places we are going to see, it's always an expansion, and then you have a constriction. So you move, unity, and then because of various things, it fragments and it becomes a mess from the political point of view. So that's what happened at the end of the Zhao, and you enter a period which is called the Warring States, because these various places which were all together, you know, divided, and they started warring with each other. What is interesting is that during the Warring State period, this is 5th and 4th century before Christ, you have the key people of culture, of Chinese culture, who live roughly at the same time. So you have Confucius, you have Lao Tzu, and you have Sun Tzu, which are the three main characters that are going to shape the Chinese culture until today. You know, Confucius in education, Lao Tzu with the Tao, is the creator of the Tao and the Yi King and all these type of things. And Sun Tzu is the man of the war, who has written the famous book about how to do war. So that's 500 roughly, 450 before Christ. And then in 220, you have, or 40, you have a younger king from one of the warring factions, warring kingdoms, called Qin. And it's a smaller area, but he's very aggressive, and he's going to rebuild the kind of unity of the Chinese empire of those days. It's not yet as big as today, but still, it's still already very important. And that's the famous Qin Shi Huang Di. Everybody perhaps has heard of him because his tomb is in Xi'an, and there you have the famous terracotta army of soldiers who are attending, who have been attending for 2,000 years, you know, the funeral rites of the emperor. So that's the first, it's considered as one of the first main dynasties. And then you have the Han, and you have a series of other dynasties. And for me, the great one in terms of culture is the Tang dynasty from 600 to 900 after Christ, and where you have a fantastic florescence of sculpture, buildings, and writings, calligraphy. You know, that's really the China we dream of when we enter a museum. Yeah? And then you have, after 900, there are another dynasty, but then you have the most important one for Europe is the Yuan. That is, China was conquered by the Mongols in the beginning of the 11th century. And the Mongols, it's one of the first times that a foreigner took over the seat of the Chinese emperor. And this man was called Kublai Khan. And it's important because he is the one who received Marco Polo. When the Venetians tried to affirm the Chinese Silk Road, you know, or between Venice and Xi'an. So Marco Polo went there, walked there with his two uncles, and he discovered this China, which was not really, which was a Mongolian China, but still it had taken over most of the things of preceding China. Then you have the Ming, which is, or the Song, which has fantastic, if you like, ceramics, the Song ceramics, it's just beautiful. And then you have the Ming, which is also well known, in the blue and white, the China pottery, etc., which was imported by the Dutch in particular. And you have then in Holland all this development of the blue and white pottery, which is in fact based on the Chinese pottery. But now we are moving away from China. So that's the whole, my picture of the short picture of China as it has developed, and until 1912, where it's the end of with the Qin dynasty, and then it's modern history with the Republic, and then Mao Zedong and etc. That's very recent. So I think that gives you, and I think that the important thing for you is really, I suppose, to be around the Tang, the great efflorescence of the Chinese culture. Your turn.
Thank you so much for this introduction. Mm-hmm. I do remember also reading that at the time when we measured, and we will be We will be revealing the frequencies of the ancient Chinese civilizations. This was the time when the silk was discovered by the Chinese, and the paper, right? The papier was also created by the Chinese. So let's go into the revelations and the numbers of, as you said, the Chinese Renaissance period. And the time that we measured was between 1600 BC and 1046 BC. This was the peak of their civilization. So and again, we're looking at the collective consciousness of humanity at that time. Okay, so we're going to go through all the numbers.
Collective consciousness of the Chinese people.
Yes, Chinese civilization, the humanity at that time of the Chinese civilization. The overall frequency was the frequency of 400. The frequency of 400 is reason. So again, they had this very analytical approach towards life. Health, they view through the lens of neutrality, 250. Finances, 400. Reason, and again, this was the time period for the Silk Road, right? Creativity, this is a very interesting part. The creativity was 500. So they had this incredible imagination, and perhaps this is how a lot of the things that you've just touched upon were created, because this was truly their Renaissance period. Relationships, they viewed through the lens of courage, 200. Personal growth, 500. Love. So again, that they had this inspiration of being creative and being committed to personal growth in the frequency of love. Philanthropy, the art of sharing and giving, that was 310. Willingness. Intuition was at the frequency of 250 for the human collective, for the Chinese ancient civilization, which is neutrality. And then we checked 4 aspects of intuition. Clairaudience was at 200. Courage. Clairsentience, 400. And I'm assuming that because they were so in touch with their feeling, this is how the creative process also begins, right? Clairvoyance, 250, and claircognizance, 250. Now, we also looked at 4 aspects of intelligence. The IQ, they viewed through the lens of 250, neutrality. EQ, 250, also neutrality, so quite balanced. SQ, the social quotient, how did they feel collectively, right? And that was 250. And the one aspect of that was an unprocessed emotion, and that was AQ, adversity. What emotion was triggered collectively when they had to deal with challenging situations, and that was fear, 100. They enjoyed their role collectively at 74%, ego 100%, and out of that 100% inferior, so that feeling of not good enough. And that also could be very cultural, but as we'll see today in this episode, this is a theme for the human collective and for most human beings, this inadequate feeling. In the now, 81%, integrity 100%. Integrity to themselves, 100%. Integrity to others, 98%. It's also quite unusual, really high number. Self-awareness, 76%. Clarity, 94%. So collectively, they were very clear about their vision of life. Alignment with divine purpose for that civilization was 98%, so really high. And alignment of their personal purpose from a collective perspective, 100%. Compassion, 88%. Empathy, 93%. Energy purity, 100%. So they embodied this intellect, this reasoning, right? Analytical thinking at 100%. And they experienced the 5th dimension 29% of the time. So also very interesting. And it's probably due to their creativity at 500 and the commitment to personal growth at 500, which, as you said, this is their Renaissance period, right? Mm-hmm. So the next one we'll go to is the Roman civilization.
So the Roman civilization is again a very long story, because you can start at 753 before Christ, when Rome officially was founded by Remus and Romulus. And again, the question of the pharaoh, you created a city by taking a plow and plowing around the territory which was going to be the city. And that's when Remus and Romulus had a fight, and one of the two was killed. So that, it's the old story of how you build a city on a human sacrifice, in fact. This was a way of feeding the land with the blood of one of the two brothers. So Rome was founded in 753, and it was a rather small city in Latium, which is the Latin part of Italy in those days, that little by little grew. So you have first monarchy until 500, and then it becomes a republic. And the republic is going to last until 30 before Christ. And that's the moment where the Romans are going to spread. First, they go north. There were Gauls in the Po Valley, and they got rid of, they conquered them, and they assimilated them. And then they moved on to France, to Spain, etc. And then there was all the wars with the Punic Wars with the Phoenicians and Carthago. And so they took hold of northern Africa, etc. This grows, and in 30, Julius Caesar takes, we are going to come back to that afterwards. They take quite a few places, and when we speak about Egypt. And then in 27, Augustus becomes the first emperor, and before Christ. And the empire goes from 27 before Christ until 476 in the western part of the empire, that is mainly Western Europe and so on. But it goes on until 1453 in the eastern part of the empire. So you can consider that the Roman history starts from 750 before Christ to 1453 after Christ. So that's more than 2,000 years of presence. So what are the great moments of this period? From the civilization point of view, or the cultural point of view, it's really the first, second century, with people like Virgil and Cicero and etc. These people whom we read at school if we take Latin, and so on. And these are the people who have, in a very, very much shaped what is our Western culture still today. And you have to remember that we still teach in schools, not necessarily in the States, Roman law, because Roman law is the basis of the legal system in most of Europe and in Latin America, by opposition to the common law in Britain, the States, Australia, and Canada. So, and the Roman law has been used from the time of the Republic, and it was when the Western Empire was taken over by the barbarians, then the Justinian, who became the emperor in the East, decided that it was important to collect all the laws of the empire and put them into one codex, one book, and that's the Codex Justinianus, which has been used as the basis of the teaching of law ever since. So that's the important contribution of the Romans was in fact the legal aspect. The Greeks brought culture in the sense of architecture, sculpture, it's philosophy. The Romans really were much more down-to-earth people. So you needed legal system, good roads, good irrigation system, so that you could build a solid civilization on solid ground. So that's my introduction to the Romans.
Thank you so much for that.
Wonderful.
And we'll go into the numbers, which is so in alignment with what you just described.
Yes, it's one of the most powerful civilizations. The Roman civilization, right? From 550 BC to 465 AD.
That's the period, right?
That's the period that we have measured. The overall frequency is 400, level of reason. When it comes to health, they viewed health through the lens of reason as well, at 400. Finances, 400. Creativity, 400. Relationships, 100. Level of fear. Personal growth, 400. Philanthropy, 310. Level of willingness. Intuition, 310. And within intuition, we have clairaudience, 200, level of courage, clairsentience, 310, clairvoyance, 250, and claircognizance at 400. That is their inner knowing. Then under the intelligence aspect, we have IQ at 250, level of neutrality, EQ, the emotional quotient, at 100, level of fear, SQ, social quotient, at 200, level of courage. And AQ, the adversary quotient, at 50, level of apathy. And in the joy, how much they enjoyed their role in this reality, it was 63%. In the ego, 100%, and 100% of that was the inferior version of the ego. In the now, 57%. Integrity, 91%. Integrity to self, 95%. And integrity to others, 57%. Self-awareness, 73%. Clarity, 80%. Alignment with divine purpose, 84%. Alignment with personal purpose, 97%. Compassion, 88%. Exactly the same as the Chinese civilization, I believe.
Compassion, yeah.
Empathy, 87%. Energy purity, 85%. And they really hardly ever experienced the fifth dimension. At least we got 0%.
So they were
the
strictly in
fifth
their
dimension. They were strictly in their head and their mind, with the intention of, as you mentioned, makes sense, creating structures and
legal systems,
yes,
infrastructure.
Infrastructures, yes, to create a solid foundation, right, to build on, and for control as well, since they provided the Roman law, right? And well, it makes sense with the EQ at 100, relationships at 100. And since we're all constantly thinking about conquering or expanding, they were mostly out of the present moment,
That's true.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
true.
And very much into politics, since integrity to others was at 57%.
Interesting. It's drastically different than the peak of the Chinese civilization, which they were so high in their alignment, or their integrity was extremely high to themselves and to others, and also high alignment with divine and personal purpose. There is absolutely a drastic difference, right?
when it comes to the processing information, right?
And it's interesting, they all, both started at around 400. So, you know, that as if it was, reason was the first, you know, force behind, or first ground to develop as an empire. Okay, next one.
The next one is the Indus Civilization.
Indus Valley Civilization.
Indus Valley Civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, can't hear you. Let's unmute.
Micro, voila. So the Indus, it's a fascinating area because the Indus Valley has been for a very long time the border between Western civilization and influence and more Asian type of influences. So, you know, it starts from the Himalaya and goes through Tibet, and then it goes down today through in northern India and into Pakistan down to the ocean, the Indian Ocean. So this is an important north-south line, which explains that Alexander stopped there, that you know, other people, really, that was the border before entering the rest of India or more. So very different type of civilizations. So the Indus Valley, it was, there is the civilization you are speaking of, which is an ancient civilization, is one of the three oldest. So you have the Indus, you have Mesopotamia, we are going to see later, and you have, and Egypt, we will discuss also later. So they are all between 6,000, 4,000. They begin with around these periods. But the main period in the Indus is from 2,500 to 1,700 before Christ. And it was small. There were two towns, which was Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. People hear of Mohenjo-daro because it's, if you're interested in history, everybody speaks, or many people speak of this. This is in southern Pakistan, and it's a rather large area where they found interesting ruins in 1921, 1922. So it's a rather new understanding of this Indus Valley civilization. And so it was mainly two cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and they started as usual, like, you know, with cultivating wheat and barley in that area and using the Indus River as the source of the irrigation system, which allowed them to build, as usual, a surplus in food, which could be sold, and that's the beginning of trade, and so on and so on. So this group was interesting because they were very well organized, it seems, because we don't know much about them. We have only a few instruments and interesting pieces of pottery or a few bronze things, but not much. But they had an embassy, in a way, in Mesopotamia. So it means that there was enough trade for having a group, a counter, you know, of the Indus Valley in Mesopotamia, which is 1,000 kilometers away, so it's not close. But this means that there were exchanges and things were happening. Then there was in 1700, there was an attack from the Indo-Europeans, which were not yet in India, but were coming from the north, and they destroyed Mohenjo-daro, and this was the end of this Indus civilization, although some areas further south were kept and went on and then became part of the Indian civilization to the east, so, and the central of India. I think that's enough, because otherwise I'll speak too long.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, so the time period that we measured the human collective of the Indus Valley Civilization was between 3,300 BC and 1900 BC. Okay, the human collective of that civilization at that time was the frequency of courage, 200. They viewed health through the lens of fear, 100. So it's interesting because, as you said, there's not enough information, but this also gives us, I would say, a wider lens to be able to perceive this kind of people of that time.
So how they process the information. Right?
Finances, they view through the lens of courage. So you talked about trade or beginning of trade. Creativity, they had a relationship with creativity through the lens of reason, 400. Now, relationships, they view through the lens of 50. 50 is apathy. So there was some kind of manipulation on the collective level for that civilization. Personal growth, 250, which is neutrality. Philanthropy, courage, 200. Intuition, courage. Clairaudience under intuition is 200, courage. Clairsentience, which is feeling, their relationship with feeling in their body was fear, 100. And it's usually we see that it's a pattern. In most cases, it's linked to the frequency of health. Clairvoyance, they view through the lens of courage, and claircognizance, also courage, 200. Now, IQ, they view through the lens of courage, again, 200. EQ was 50. So it's very interesting because they were very much disconnected from their emotional intelligence and driven a lot by the intellect, right? Or the information that was acquired. And you can see that in their health, in their relationships aspect, and clairsentience. SQ, how they felt being in groups of people, and it was 200, courage. And adversity quotient was 50. Again, this disassociation, disconnection. They enjoyed their role 56% of the time. They were in the ego 100%, and out of that 100% inferior. Again, we're seeing this pattern with this third ancient civilization, right, emerging. In the now, 47%. Integrity, 94%. And out of that, integrity to self, 93%, but integrity to others, 57%. And again, you know, if you look at how they related to others, at relationship frequency of 50, right? The EQ 50. So definitely there was a big disconnect. Self-awareness, 56%, because they were very much driven by the ego, right? Clarity, 80%. What's interesting is their alignment with divine purpose was 100%. And alignment with personal purpose, 98%.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an important milestone, I would say, for humanity, right? Birthing of humanity in many ways. Empathy or compassion, 72%. Empathy, 83%. And you can see the compassion at 72% with 50 in relationships, right? There was definitely a big disconnect there. Energy purity, 78%. And of course, we measured the fifth dimension, and they were not experiencing fifth dimension because they were very much in their survival mode, the courageous mode. And, you know, somebody will say, well, why is it that they're aligned with divine purpose 100%? It was a great learning for the human soul collective. And this was an important stepping stone for that.
And then under the creativity, they have the level of reason at 400. It says that the people of the Indus Valley Civilization achieved great accuracy in measuring its length, mass, and time. And based on artifacts found in excavations, it is evident that the culture was rich in arts and crafts as well.
Okay, well, there you go. Now, the next one will be the Aztecs.
The Aztec. We move to the other side of the world. Okay. So we moved to Latin America and in fact to Mexico. So the Aztec Empire was an alliance of 3 city-states in the valley, which is now called the Valley of Mexico. And it started rather late because the Aztec is 1428 and it lasted less than 100 years because in 1521, Cortes arrived from Spain and defeated the Aztec system with the help of local tribes. You know, it was not simply a few Spaniards arriving, but the Cortes found a way to push a few tribes to join him against the rulers, the Aztec rulers. So the Aztec, in fact, was really an alliance of a military type of alliance. And they were just taking over the groups here and there and expanding the empire. And until rebellion began, then they came in, you know, mastered the people, and there was a new emperor, etc. So it was not really an easy system of life. But the Aztec at the same time left the rulers of the conquered areas to be the leaders of the local kingdom in a way, a little what the Romans also did. The Romans did not settle and with Italians all over the place, Romans all over the place. They conquered and then left the Gauls or the Iberians, etc., in charge, and they were becoming kind of servants of, and they had to pay tribute to the center, to Rome. But the same thing with the Aztec. They just took every 6 months a certain amount of money of the various people they controlled. What the imperial authority gave to the conquered areas was some kind of stability and protection, which is again something you recognize in many imperial organizations, because even the Holy Roman Empire in Europe was based on the same idea. The Habsburg were, of course, the emperors for nearly 1,000 years, but they left a lot of power to the various places they were controlling. Even in the 19th century, when Hungary was kind of a second power in the Austrian Empire. So in the Aztec, there was a polytheistic religion, but the imperial god was the important one. So everybody could do what they wanted in terms of what they believed, but like in Rome, they had to comply with the basic belief of the central god. So in Rome, it became the emperor himself, but in you had a name, an impossible name to pronounce. Okay, and they were in fact a rather short-lived empire that followed the Toltec and the Olmec that had been there before, and the Teotihuacan. Mexico already existed with a different name, but it's the Aztec who gave the name of Mexico to the area and to the Teotihuacan, so which was the religious center.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And now we'll dive into the vibrational frequencies of Aztec Collective.
My turn?
Mm-hmm. Your turn.
The Aztec Civilization. we measured from 1345 AD to 1521 AD, just until when Cortez showed up, right? Their overall frequency was 350, the level of acceptance. They viewed the aspect of health through the lens of acceptance at 350, finances 200, level of courage, creativity 400, level of reason, relationships 100, level of fear, personal growth 200, philanthropy 75, level of grief, intuition 350, level of acceptance. Again, with an intuition, we have clairaudience at 350, clairsentience 100, clairvoyance 350, and claircognizance 350. Within the aspect of intelligence, we have IQ at 200, EQ 100, the emotional quotient 100, level of fear, SQ 175, level of pride, and AQ, the adversity quotient at 30, that is the level of guilt. Now, in the joy, 55%. In the ego, 100%. And 100% of that is the inferior version of the ego. In the now, 54%. Integrity, 60%. Integrity to self, 96%. Integrity to others, 43%. Self-awareness, 55%. Clarity, 65%. Alignment with divine purpose, 59%. Aligning with personal purpose, 98%. And we have compassion at 76%, empathy, 86%, energy purity, 52%. And they were not experiencing the fifth dimension much. We measured it at 0%.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the Aztecs were one of the Mesoamerican civilization which use human sacrifice, and so quite a few figures you just gave could correspond to this use of human blood to rule and conquer. So anyway, what's the next one?